What's going on YouTube? It's Teej, back again with another video, and today we are going team by team and regrading the 2018 NFL Draft. As of right now, I'm planning on this being the last regrade, but I'd love to hear your thoughts if you're enjoying this series and taking a trip down memory lane and looking back at older draft classes. Let me know down below in the comment section. Maybe we'll do 2017 and maybe even beyond that as well. But also tomorrow we will be doing a 2018 redraft, which I'm super excited about. Going to record it here pretty shortly, so excited to pump that video out to y'all as well. But if you've missed any of the previous regrades, highly encourage you to go back, check those videos out. But this is a very simple concept, and let's waste no time and jump right into it. And let me hear your thoughts down below in the comment section. How do you look at this 2018 draft class, and what would you grade your favorite team's 2018 draft haul? So we start with the Cardinals, right? So Josh Rosen obviously is a tricky one here, but let's focus on what good came out of this. I think Christian Kirk's had better play in Jacksonville than Arizona, but there were still a couple of years where Kirk was okay. Mason Cole, was fine, in Arizona, and he's kind of still that in Pittsburgh. Chase Edmonds is, decent running back to have in a committee, and then not much else to talk about the rest of the way. So yeah, it's not a great draft class, and especially when these guys leave Arizona and then end up being better elsewhere, specifically in Christian Kirk. It makes it kind of hard to give this grade out. And I think I got to go D+. Yeah, I'm going to go D+ here. Edmonds had some okay games, and Kirk's had some solid production. Maybe you could sway me in the direction of a C-, but the biggest swing of the bat here was Josh Rosen at pick 10, and we all know that did not end up working out. Then we get to the Atlanta Falcons. Calvin Ridley obviously started out as a really nice number 2, and there was potential for him to take over as that number 1 wide receiver, but suspension, ultimately then traded to Jacksonville, but still a good player. And I think taking him at 26, pretty good value to take him at. Isaiah Oliver didn't end up working out. I was excited about him coming out of Colorado, though. Ito Smith, Russell Gage, pretty solid player, and became a really nice piece there as their wide receiver 3 when they still had Julio, and was still even okay as their number 2. And then Foyesei Oluokun, actually a pretty solid player, safety converted to eventually play linebacker. They don't end up re-signing him, but was actually a pretty good player and a solid hit there in the 6th round. So I'm going to go C+ here. For a while, it's hard because the 3 players that stand out the most here are not Falcons anymore, Ridley, Gage, and Oluokun. But all in all, I think they got good production out of those 3 guys. And when you just look at it from a value standpoint, Russell Gage proved to be better than a 6th rounder. Oluokun proved to be better than a 7th rounder. And Ridley, I would argue, you will see tomorrow, goes earlier than 26 in my redraft. So I think they got some good value there, and ultimately those guys were pretty good contributors for a pretty good stretch there while the Falcons were still competitive. Then we get to the Baltimore Ravens. So off the top, this is going to be, I'm going to go ahead and give it an A, because Lamar Jackson, the most important position in the game, you hit on it. They just gave him that extension. He's their franchise guy moving forward. So you're already kind of starting that A tier. And then you talk about Orlando Brown Jr., who was a multi-year starter and then flipped for ultimately the equivalence of another first-round pick. So they ultimately kind of got back what they spent, or they got back better value than what they took Orlando Brown Jr. at. They took him in the 3rd round, ended up getting a first-round value out of him. That's awesome. And then also Mark Andrews, who's emerged as one of the 5 best tight ends in football. So all this to kind of lead us down the road of, this is going to be an A. Not every pick was great, but even some of those under-the-radar ones, like Deshaun Elliott, solid player while he was there. I had a lot of excitement about Anthony Everett and Kenny Young. Ultimately, those guys end up going elsewhere, and maybe Everett still can work out a spot to become a starter somewhere. And then also Hayden Hurst doesn't last all that long in Baltimore, and he's just kind of your run-of-the-mill, solid enough, good enough tight end in the league. But you hit with Lamar, you got him as who's been his best pass catcher in Mark Andrews the last couple of years, and you also got a multi-year starter at one of the most important positions at football, at offensive tackle, flipped him for a higher evaluation than the draft selection you took him at. That's got to be a win. And plus Deshaun Elliott, like I mentioned earlier, and also Bradley Bozeman. I had his name covered up, but Bradley Bozeman was a solid player for them, and he not making a whole lot of money in Carolina, but solid player. I think an above-average starter at center, and the fact that he went in the 6th round is still kind of mind-boggling to me. So A- there for Baltimore. Buffalo Bills. I'm going to go with an A here, and Josh Allen's ultimately the most important part of this, and to me, he's one of the 3 best quarterbacks in football. So it was going to take a lot for them not to get an A. Now, granted, I think there's some arguments. Maybe they didn't have the perfect draft, right? Like A kind of insinuates it's a perfect draft, but I think hitting on Josh Allen kind of covers your bases and makes up for where maybe you didn't have extreme value. Tremaine Edmonds, though, good solid starter for them for 5 years, maybe a little bit more in that solid territory. The back half of his rookie contract, maybe was a little rough at the beginning stages, but coming off his best year was a part of why they won that division. Harrison Phillips been a bit of a disappointment. Teron Johnson's actually a pretty nice nickel player, though. Wyatt Teller, what could have been, had they just rode out with him in Buffalo, considering he's emerged as one of the best guards in the NFL, and he's going to be in the first round in tomorrow's redraft. Ray McLeod, solid special teamer. He didn't last long in Buffalo either. I'd feel even more certain about calling this an A if they still had Wyatt Teller on the roster, especially when they kind of have an IOL need right now. Edmonds, multi-year starter. Teller, you look at it just from a value standpoint, they nabbed a guy who was way better than a fifth rounder. And of course, they hit on Josh Allen. So yeah, I feel like this team just kind of has to hit an A. With a lot of that, though, I admit, being Josh Allen. Carolina Panthers. Tough one to grade, and I am taking a little bit into account that DJ Moore ultimately was a big part of the reason they could move from 9 to 1. So I am going to account for that a little bit in this evaluation. But he was a number 1 wide receiver while he was in Carolina, and that holds a ton of value in and of itself. Dante Jackson, high-end athlete, very straight-line, fast guy. Not necessarily the most polished in coverage, but I could see a world where he is, once again, their number 2 corner this upcoming season. Ian Thomas, okay tight end, and not much else to talk about the rest of the way. So this is DJ Moore, for the most part, that goes into this grade with, you take into account Jackson and Thomas, who are, okay enough, I guess. I'll go C+, and you could even sell me on maybe C is a little bit more fair, but again, with the hindsight that I now have, that, DJ Moore is a big part of the mix that takes Carolina from 9 to move up to 1 and then get the chance to draft Bryce Young. I'm going to take that into the evaluation and the grade here. I'm going to give it a C+ for the Panthers. Chicago Bears. Roquan Smith, I wish there was a world where they could have kept him around because he's still such a good football player. But ultimately, I think resetting the window for having that, elite linebacker, Tremaine Edmonds, if he, kind of builds upon what he had last year in the season that he played with in Buffalo, I could see you in 2 years' time where he starts to touch that Roquan Smith level of play. But in 2 years, I think the Bears are going to be more competitive than they are this year. So, it just kind of resets that winning window a little bit, and the players that they have matching it makes a lot of sense. So, moving on from Roquan Smith, though, still going to take a second-round pick for him, so that's not too bad. James Daniels, solid player for them. Another guy I wish they kind of kept around, but Pittsburgh ends up having him in free agency. Anthony Miller, kind of flashed in the pan, had some games, but ultimately didn't pan out. Bilal Nichols, I still think is an okay player, but not much else to really talk about from their day 3 hole. So, I'm going to go C+, because, Roquan Smith still was a really good player. Daniels was a good player there. Nichols has had some moments. Miller had some games. But this grade would definitely be higher if a lot of those pieces that I like were still in Chicago. But again, I understand you have to reset. You had to, change in the front office, change in the coaching staff. Those resets are bound to happen. So I'm not holding it too far back against Chicago. So maybe you could even say B-, but for right now, I'm going to go C+ for the Bears. Cincinnati Bengals. Billy Price, that was a swing and a miss, but you made up for it. And then some with Jesse Bates, one of the biggest steals of the second round in this year's class, or in this 2018 class, I should say. Sam Hubbard, more than capable starter there for them. I'm not saying he's an elite player, but he has been a very solid player, really good against the run. He's just kind of one of those locker room guys, it feels like, and hometown kid too, went to Ohio State, just kind of loved in the community, which I think does hold some value. And then you get further down, Darius Phillips. I was hopeful that it could have been even better than what it ultimately ended up being. Auden Tate, fantastic value there in the 7th round, but still, even then, Auden Tate has not been anything all that special. He's just kind of you're happy about him being your 4th wide receiver on a roster. So, Bates, Hubbard, the big wins out of this class. And, it'd be great if Bates was still in Cincinnati, but he's played such a huge part in their rebuild and getting them to being one of the best teams in the AFC, right? So, I'm going to go B+ because he is still a safety. And Hubbard, while I do think he is a good player, he is a good player, not a great player. So I'll go B+ there for Cincinnati. And there's a fair share of misses there. And also, they had a ton of selection. So, it just kind of buys me the idea. Quantity over quality sometimes wins out in the NFL. Not to take any credit away from the Bengals. Then we get to the Browns. Baker Mayfield, obviously, this doesn't work out. If you take a guy at number 1 overall, you want him to play for your franchise for 10 years. And that wasn't the case. Baker Mayfield had stretches where it's like, okay, this guy could be the franchise QB, but all in all, just didn't pan out. But Denzel Ward, a really good cornerback. Sometimes I feel like he's a little overhyped, but still, that being said, I still see him as a cornerback 1. But he's just a little up and down for me. Austin Corbett ultimately doesn't, he's still not on the Browns, but a solid player in the league, and was with Cleveland and still is to this day in the interior offensive line in Carolina. Nick Chubb, one of the best running backs in football and one of the best pure runners in the game that we have. And then, I was just double checking, but not much else to talk about the rest of the way for Cleveland. So huge hit with Chubb as well as Ward, and some okay players like Corbett in there, and then Baker, who did win him a playoff game. That's where I'm kind of going back and forth in my head right now. Didn't work out, but he did give them their first playoff win. And how long? I do think that holds some value. I'll go B flat. But this definitely should have been a class. If you're picking twice in the first 4 picks, you want to look back in this class and say that was an A. And that makes me really excited for tomorrow's redraft, because what I do with the first, those 2 picks in the top 4 for Cleveland, I think are just like what they did here, but supercharged. So it's really exciting to kind of look at and what could have been there in Cleveland. Then we get to the Cowboys. Leighton Vander Esch was actually a pick that still surprised me. He had a ton of late buzz, kind of building him up as the guy the Cowboys are, kind of keyed in on. But I was still a little surprised by that. He had this meteoric rise right before the draft. Boise State, though, I just felt like a lot of it was smoke, but ultimately he did end up going to the Cowboys, and he's been a solid player when he's on the field. Connor Williams, multi-year starter, now in Miami. Michael Gallup, still kind of waiting to see him fully emerge as that, you're happy with him as that number 2 wide receiver. Hasn't happened just yet. Dalton Schultz, good player. He's now in Houston, and they drafted the legend that is Mike White, which I just got to tip my cap to that. And Cedric Wilson even, wasn't this long-term, starter or anything like that, or even throughout the course of his rookie contract. But by the end of it, and his time in Dallas, he was a solid 3rd wide receiver. They almost got more out of him than they did with Gallup in a lot of ways. Solid class and a solid draft. I'll give it a B there for Dallas. A couple of headline names, quote-unquote headline names that are still there. And even guys that are gone, I think were, solid pieces and reliable starters while they were in Dallas. Let me get to Denver. Bradley Chubb. I never saw him as like a Von Miller prospect, but the idea of pairing him up with Von Miller was really exciting at the time. Was not mad about that selection there at 5 overall, not at any stretch. Cortland Sutton, I think a pretty good player, but it's been a while since we've seen him play at that, peak of his potential powers. Royce Freeman's a swing and a miss. Josie Jewell is actually, I think, a pretty solid coverage linebacker when he's healthy. I was intrigued by Deshaun Hamilton and Troy Fumagalli, but those ultimately did not pan out. And then, David Williams, the last pick there for the Broncos. So it's Chubb. It's what I think Sutton can be full-time. But again, we still haven't seen it full, for multi-year stretches or really even for a 17-game stretch throughout the course of the season, or at least it's been some time since that's happened. And Jewell, when he's healthy, I think is okay. I'm gonna go B flat. I was initially gonna go B plus, but again, it's been some time since we've seen Sutton be the guy and that number 1 wide receiver I think he's potentially capable of being. And who knows, when we potentially do this video again next year, if Josie Jewell is coming off a 17-game season where he's fully healthy and an impact player that I think he can be, then I can bump the grade up. But for right now, he's just a little too injury prone for me to give it a B+. Detroit. Frank Ragnow's a big hit here. Tracy Walker, the solid player that they add there in the 3rd round. Kerryon Johnson, though, a miss. Deshaun Hand, I was intrigued by, but ultimately that didn't pan out. Terrell Crosby and Nick Bawden, nothing really much to talk about there. So it's Ragnow, it's Walker. Ragnow's one of the best centers in football. Walker, I think, is a solid player. So taking position value into account here, I'm going to go B-, because at least they got 2 starters, and some of the other classes that we'll talk about the rest of the way, they only get 1 starter, so I do want to have a note of differentiation. Detroit got a plus-level starter and then an average one in Walker. Some of the other teams we'll talk about the rest of the way just kind of got a plus-level starter out of it, so I'll give Detroit the bump here with a B-, and we'll talk about those other teams once we get there. Green Bay Packers, Jair Alexander has bloomed into one of the best quarterbacks in football, so huge win there. I really thought Josh Jackson would really benefit from the change in DC and Joe Barry, but then they ended up moving on from him right after they changed DC. So, ultimately he was kind of a swing and a miss there in the 2nd round. Same thing with Oren Burks in the 3rd. J.K. Scott, then a couple of, Marquez Valdez-Scantling had, he was a solid contributor, and I don't want to overlook what he did in Green Bay, but felt like he came with a lot of frustration as much as sometimes he brought that big playability. And then Equanimous St. Brown, no longer a Packer, and, his best plays of his career have not really come in Green Bay. But I do like that philosophy that Green Bay continues to do to this day, where they will double dip at a position in an NFL draft. Here it just didn't work out. But it's kind of Jair Alexander and no one else, but I think he's one of the best corners in football. So even if he is 95% of this grade, I feel pretty good giving Green Bay a B here. Again, Jair, freak, and, okay contributions for MVS is how I'll validate that. B is fair for the Packers. And then we get to the Houston Texans. No 1st or 2nd rounder, which I am taking into account a little bit here. Justin Reed, really solid value as a 3rd rounder, but, started out as a really good player, but I think he was ready to leave Houston when he ultimately did. 'Cause the last 2 years he was with the Texans. They weren't his best they weren't his best years of play. And Jordan Atkins, okay, tight end. I was always intrigued by Kiki Kute. And then not much else to really talk about the rest of the way. So I'll go C- here. Reed, couple of good years, couple of rough years. Atkins, okay enough tight end, but really nothing to write home about here for Houston. Indianapolis Colts. I mean, it's not often that we look back at a interior offensive lineman going in the top 6 and we're like, yeah, that was the right pick. But Quentin Nelson, in a lot of ways, I think you can justify as the right pick. He's a future Hall of Famer in my mind, one of the best guards that I've gotten to see play during my lifetime. So big win there. And then Shaq Leonard, to have the Nads to go draft a guy from South Carolina State in the top 40 of the NFL draft. The Colts give Chris Ballard his flowers when he deserves it. That was a hell of a snipe and one of the best picks that he's made during his tenure. And even Braden Smith, this guy who they took with the next pick. Interior offensive lineman was kind of how he was viewed, but has kind of been one of the best right tackles in football. Last year might have been a little bit of a down year, but still has been reliable and steady. And it's interesting, is one of those guys you always hear in the draft community, like sub 32-inch arm tackles don't work, with the exception of Braden Smith and blah, 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 and they'll list off a couple other names. And, hey, maybe this guy could be the next Braden Smith or da-da-da-da. So, it's just kind of interesting the impact that he's had. And he's always used as that caveat example, and he's been a good player, so I think it's warranted. And then even Nyheim Hines, who's a solid multi-year contributor in that running back committee. And Jordan Wilkins even had a couple of games in fill-in spots. He was better than I think a lot of people want to give him credit for. And then even Zaire Franklin as a 7th rounder, I think he's better than a 7th rounder with what we know in hindsight. So, I'm going to give Indianapolis an A. And really, it's from those first 3 picks, Nelson, Leonard, Smith. Those are 3 cornerstone pieces that they have on this team, specifically Nelson and Leonard. But even, Hines and Franklin, I think those are solid players that have been multi-year starters there in Indianapolis. Then we get to Jacksonville. I'm going to go ahead and this is D+. I liked Ronnie Harrison coming out of Alabama, but they ended up trading him after 2 years in Jacksonville, so we never really got to see what that looked like with him as a Jag. David Bryan, swing and miss there in the first round. Not much to talk about from their day 3 haul. And then there's DJ Chark, the one guy you could say that, had some years where he was okay in Jacksonville. But really, it was one season where it was him and Gardner Minshew, and they were the only source of potential offense. And, the only 2 guys that really had a chance to put points on the board. And that Jacksonville team was atrocious. So they were the shiniest part of, no disrespect, Jags fans, of a team that was a turd, So I don't know how much you really are like, wow, DJ Chark, awesome, that's fantastic. And even to the point where he's in Detroit for a year and that 1 year deal in Carolina, I think the league kind of sees him as like, yeah, he's fine. If you got a role for him, yeah, sure, he can do it. And if you think of him as a field stretcher, yeah, he can play that type of that part of your offense. But if you're asking him to be a number 1 wide receiver, Mr. Do Everything, that's not him. So I'll go D+. I know that does feel a little harsh because Chark is, I think, an okay player and a solid enough NFL starting wide receiver if you have him in that defined field stretching vertical wideout role. But otherwise, this class is not all that great. And he's a specialized wide receiver, so I got to go D+. Chiefs, again, no first round pick, but this is another one that's going to get a tough grade. I'm going to go D here because I think even DJ Chark at least had that one flashy season. Derek Nottie is really the only guy I look at here, and it's like, well, he's still on the team, and, I wouldn't mind if he's starting. But even Derek Nottie has been up and down as a run defender, had some years where he was, pretty nice compliment next to Chris Jones, and last couple of seasons, I feel like he's been kind of disappointing me. So, I'll go D flat here for Kansas City. One of the rare misses that they've had during, this, recent stretch where I feel like a lot of their drafts have done a good job kind of shaping the roster that we know it to be. This and then the Clyde Edwards-Helaire draft where it's like, okay, maybe there were some missteps there for KC. Then we get to the Chargers. Derwin James, when he's healthy, is one of the best safeties in football and maybe the most talented safety in football. I think there's plenty of people who would argue that. Uchenna Nwosu, coming off a really good year in Seattle, but even in LA as this guy who could drop into coverage, sometimes, rush the passer, nice hybrid player. He was pretty good. And then, Justin Jones, Kaiser White, nothing really to talk about there. Scott Quessenberry, same thing. And, Justin Jackson, a couple years where he was in the committee in the backfield, but, nothing special. So, I'm going to go B-. Nwosu, pretty good. And Derwin James, if there were no injury concerns, might take this to a B+ and even A- territory. But he is a safety, so position of lower position value. And he's also missed a lot of time. So I'm going to go B- here for the Chargers. But I do want to just also note that if you think Derwin James is a stud and like next year he's going to be fully healthy and I'm giving it too low a grade because he's a freak, I totally hear where you're coming from. But accounting for the time he's missed, I think that's what holds it back to a B-. Then we get to the Rams. So let's start with the good here. Brian Allen's been a starter for a couple of years, and he's been okay at times. Sebastian Joseph Day played a pretty vital role, I'd say, in their run to the Super Bowl. Got hurt at the very end of that, but right before that, him and Greg Gaines were really nice players to have in a rotation there with Aaron Donald, allowed them to move Donald around when they needed to. Ogbonnaya Okoronkwo saw some potential, saw some upside, but teams are still kind of mining what might be there in free agency, signing them to these short-term deals. The Rams kind of got off that at the right time, I think, even though I do think there is upside there with Okoronkwo, but teams haven't found that just yet. Now, I wish they held on to John Franklin Myers because I think that's a piece that defensive line could really use right now. And I wish Joe Noteboom, I hope that Joe Noteboom, I should say, gets back to where he was 2 years ago and spot starts for Andrew Whitworth versus what we saw last year before the injury. Because last year he was not very good whatsoever. And then just give him that extension, making $15+ million a year. They need him to pan out. But yeah, if considering the last thing I saw was really rough from Noteboom, I feel like this grade is a little skewed in my mind. But ultimately, yeah, I look at Sebastian Joseph Day as like a part of their Super Bowl run. Allen as a multi-year starter. Okoronkwo, an okay third pass rusher that they used in that Super Bowl run. But really not a whole lot to be excited about. I'm gonna go D+. If what I saw last from Noteboom was better, I'd probably say C-. But even Brian Allen, who's been a multi-year starter, hasn't been anything special, right? So, like, yeah, I just feel like this draft class, especially considering the number of selections, I know later on in the draft, but still, the Rams are this team that always finds that dime in the rough. I mean, Cooper Kupp, there's plenty of big wins that they have throughout their draft history, and Les Snead just has a knack for being able to find one random diamond in the rough. This was one of those classes where he didn't, he wasn't able to do that. Let me get to the Miami Dolphins, and kind of like what I talked about with some of the other trades and players that were moved on from and their teams. Earlier on in this video, Minkah Fitzpatrick drafted 11 overall this year, or in this class for Miami. A couple years later, gets traded to Pittsburgh, and I think that was for pick 15. Maybe it was like 17, but in that middle of the first round range. So they basically recouped their value. And he wasn't as good as in Miami as he was when he especially first got to Pittsburgh, but even to this day with the Steelers. So, I think it's a move that kind of made sense for both sides. Mike Gesicki, pre-Mike McDaniels, is a pretty solid tight end and a solid contributor for that offense. Jerome Baker's a player I actually like a lot. Jerome Smythe, Kalen Ballage, okay, fine enough players. Jason Sanders actually had some years where he's been one of the better kickers in football. So, solid class. Nothing that ultimately, changed the foundation of this Miami franchise as we know it, but I'll give him a B. Fitzpatrick, good player. Wasn't a great fit in Miami. They ended up recouping that value. Gesicki, solid before McDaniel. Baker, an okay player, and a couple other solid names that they've added to the roster along the way, the rest of that draft. Minnesota Vikings. So this is one of those other classes, kind of like the Lions, where I was like, you got Ragnow, who's one of the best players at his position, plus Tracy Walker. So you got a high-level starter and then one other okay starter. The other team I was kind of comparing them to was Minnesota, where, long story short, Brian O'Neill's the only real big-name haul here that, it's kind of funny. Actually, I'll go on a quick tangent. Daniel Carlson, he's emerged as one of the best kickers in football, and he was drafted by a team that has had such a long stretch of kicking woes up until maybe the last year or two, that it's like, man, if they just kind of wait a little bit longer and, seen what Carlson developed into, maybe those kicking woes would have gone by the wayside a little earlier. But anyways, tangent aside, basically this is Brian O'Neill and not much else here in this class, especially considering Carlson's best years have come with the Raiders. But Brian O'Neill is one of the better right tackles in football, so I do have to, take that into account. And they got him at one of the last picks in the second round. That's impressive, and that's really good value. So I'm going to go C+ because they got that one high-end plus-level starter in Brian O'Neill and not much else. But the impact that O'Neill has had, and for a couple of years there, he was really their only good offensive lineman in Minnesota. So can't undersell the significance of that selection. New England Patriots, Isaiah Wynn, I was optimistic about what he could do in New England, but ultimately they part ways for a reason. Sonny Michel, that didn't work out. Jawan Bentley, I guess it's fine as a starting linebacker, serviceable, gets the job done. Braxton Berrios ultimately becomes a Jet. Keon Crossan, that didn't really go anywhere either. He was a prospect I was intrigued by as a 7th rounder. Disappointing draft class here for the Patriots. I'll go D+ because Bentley was there. Wynn, had some starts under his belt. Michelle, came up big in that postseason run and whatnot. But ultimately, I think that production would have just gone to any other running back. If it wasn't Sonny Michel, it was just going to be someone else. I got to go D+ here. Another one of those kind of weird drafts towards the end of the 2010s for New England where it's like, sheesh, what is Bill Belichick doing? The New Orleans Saints, Marcus Davenport, they move up and make that selection at 14. It was a little risky. It was perceived as a very, very big risk at the time for New Orleans, and I bet with hindsight they would maybe wait a little bit longer and see if they can not give up basically an extra first round pick for Davenport, and see if they can get him a little bit later on. But he was a solid player while he was in New Orleans, albeit with a smaller role too, so you have to kind of take that into account as well. Traquan Smith, there were a couple of years where I was waiting for him to break out, never really happened. And then Boston Scott, his best years, you don't think about him as a New Orleans Saint. And then Will Clapp, Great name, meme legend, but 7th rounder backup interior offensive lineman. It's just kind of the name that makes me laugh, but that's all. So yeah, it's kind of Marcus Davenport, not much else. And even Davenport, again, his best years came with, kind of the asterisk of, he's playing 500, 600 snaps. He's not this every down difference maker like a Cam Jordan maybe. So I'll go with a C. I'm not saying that Davenport's a bad player or Traquan Smith's a bad player or anything like that. It's just Davenport could have had a bigger role. Smith could have been a better player, and that changes the grade, but ultimately they were just kind of meh. So that's why, C kind of feels right here for the Saints. Just meh. The Giants, so they take Saquon Barkley at 2, and over Josh Allen. So, it's like hindsight's 2020, but, and even Lamar Jackson as well. And, it's funny, when we thought Lamar might leave Baltimore, it was like, well, could Lamar go to the Giants? And it's like, well, had you played your cards a little different, you might have taken him here at 2. I don't think anybody at the time was thinking that Lamar should go 2, but, with hindsight, of course, we'll talk about that more tomorrow's video. That's the whole point of that tomorrow's video. So I want, spill the beans. But Saquon at 2, he is still a freak player, and he's one of the best running backs in football, so don't take that away from him. Will Hernandez, it's never a good sign when a guy's best year is his rookie season, and then he only gets worse after that. And I know there was some turnover with, the offensive line coach, and, Joe Judge's, era just in New York in general did not pan out. But yeah, it's never a good sign when that guy's first season's his best year. But I'm hoping that, he stays healthy this year and Arizona gets back on track and kind of hits new heights. Lorenzo Carter, good athlete, but not much else. BJ Hill, his best moments have come with the Bengals, so you don't really think of him with the Giants. Kyle Aletta was pretty much an immediate headache for the Giants, so yikes. So it's kind of Saquon Barkley, not much else. He's a running back, one of the best running backs in football. But you also got to think about the opportunity cost of where else they could have gone with this selection. I'll go C-, because again, Saquon's a freak. I'm not denying that, but a team that needed a quarterback, they ultimately go running back at 2, and that kind of prolonged this period of disappointment for the Giants by another year or 2 because they didn't address the most important position in the game. Then we get to the Jets. Sam Darnold, so the other New York team did address quarterback, and obviously that turned out almost as disastrous. And then, Chris Herndon, we were always kind of waiting for that breakout. Never happened. It's really Folo Fadakasi is the only other name that's worth mentioning here. But, it's kind of Fadakasi, the bust that is Darnold, and then not much else to talk about here. So I'm going to go D-flat. Fadakasi was an okay run stopper, but that's about as much as I can hang my hat on with this Jets draft. And honestly, if you said D-, I wouldn't argue against you. Then the Raiders, this is another one that I'm going to give a C+ because this is Colton Miller and not much else. And we kind of hit a little point of repetition here towards the end of this video, but I just found that with a lot of these classes, it was kind of one and done. Colton Miller was emerged as one of the better tackles in football, so that's great. But they gave Brandon Parker his chances, never really panned out. Arden Key, his best years came elsewhere. Maurice Hurst, because of the heart condition, falls to day 3. Thought it was worth taking the risk, but again, hasn't really worked out. He's not even in or on the Raiders roster anymore, and then not much else to talk about with the rest of the class. It's Colton Miller again and no one else, so I stand firm in the C+ range for the Raiders. Eagles, I'm going to give it an A. Dallas Goedert, one of the best tight ends in football, and a big part of their Super Bowl run last year, and a guy that wasn't the number 1 tight end at the time, but Ertz was on the decline. Goddard was kind of on the upswing when they did win a Super Bowl, so got to take that into account as well. Jordan Mailata stole a starting spot away from a first-rounder and Andre Dillard and has emerged as one of the best tackles in football. Josh Sweat, solid player in that rotation across the defensive line. They always want to have depth there, and I think Josh Sweat's really good depth options. And then Avonte Maddox, who, kind of like Teron Johnson we talked about with the Bills earlier, one of the better nickel corners in football. Heck, I think Avonte Maddox is, when he's healthy, probably a better player than Teron Johnson. So, yeah, and again, all these guys have played integral roles and had their moments in, kind of the spotlight in Eagles Super Bowl runs of years past. So yeah, it's kind of hard not to think of this as an A, despite no first rounder, no third rounder. I just think Howie Roseman did the best that he could with the assets available in this class, and yeah, I gotta give him an A for his efforts. The Pittsburgh Steelers, this is a D-. Maybe you could say it's a D because the Chukwuma Okorafor is maybe on the upswing, but I put that in quotations because I hear that from some people, but I don't really buy into it. So Terrell Edmonds was never a player I was super fond of as a Steelers fan, but he was a multi-year starter, so give him that. But just because he started doesn't mean it was necessarily great. James Washington didn't work out. Mason Rudolph, that didn't pan out. Chugs Okorafor slated to start, but he's been kind of average at best. But with the penalties and his pass protection issues, I have a hard time calling him average. Marcus Allen, solid special teamers. Jalen Samuels, they had some pass catching role opportunities for a couple of years, but nothing that really materialized into anything more. So when Chugs Okorafor is kind of like the best thing to come out of this class, and the lone starter still on the team out of this class, that's not a good sign. So I got to go D here for Pittsburgh. San Francisco 49ers. I feel like I've been kind of harsh to 49ers fans this offseason. I didn't love their free agency. I didn't love their NFL draft. So I may be overcompensating with this grade, but I'm going to go A-. And let's focus on the big hits here, because the big wins are Mike McGlinchey, who was a multi-year starter. I get it. Mike McGlinchey wasn't perfect, and he's not an awesome pass protector or anything like that. I'm not saying he's one of the best tackles in football. Like, I take, Brian O'Neill, we talked about with the Vikings earlier. I take him at right tackle over McGlinchey, but he was a good fit for that blocking scheme, good on the move, and a really solid run blocker. So he kind of was the guy that Shanahan needed to fill that role. And then Fred Warner's emerged as perhaps the best off-ball linebacker in football, if not the best. He's one of the best. You get him in the third round out of BYU, an absolute steal. Dante Pettis is, maybe fine. And then, DJ Reed would have been great if he stayed in San Francisco. He's a really good player, but the 49ers didn't reap those benefits. Richie James, okay special teamer, but again, not a guy on the roster anymore. So yeah, it's McGlinchey, it's Warner. Those are two pretty big hits, and I've been kind of mean to the 49ers fans and what I thought their team did this offseason, how I didn't really love it. So I'm going to overcompensate now and give San Francisco an A-. Seattle, yeah, Rashad Penny in the first round. That shocked a lot of people at the time. Will Dissly, maybe an okay tight end in hindsight. Shaquem Griffin, didn't really work out. Trey Flowers, that's a miss. And then, yeah, Michael Dixon, not much else to really talk about the rest of the way. So, sorry, Seattle fans. And I know there's a lot of love for Rashad Penny, but he's in Philadelphia now anyways. And, when he was healthy, maybe there were some games. But when you're kind of holding on to 5, 6, 7, maybe 8 super productive games for Rashad Penny through a 4-year rookie contract, that's not good. So, I'll go D- here for Seattle. I'm not going to give out a whole lot of Fs, so that's kind of the only reason it's not an F, and you did get some production out of these guys. So, D- there for Seattle. Not their best draft class by any means. Then we get to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I'm going to go B+ here. Vita Vea, when he is locked in, one of the best nose tackles in football, in my opinion. MJ Stewart was, maybe a little overhyped coming out of UNC, but the guy they took 10 picks later, to me, one of the more underrated corners in football, and I'm glad that he's still in Tampa Bay after re-signing there in the 2022 offseason. And Carlton Davis, Alex Kappa was a starter in the Super Bowl run, not in Tampa Bay anymore, but was a solid player while playing for the Bucs. Jordan Whitehead, same thing, where he was a big part of that three-man safety rotation that they had, and a really good football player and better than a fourth rounder in my opinion. So yeah, B+. Couple of big hits, and a couple of those hits are not on the roster anymore, but they played a big role in a team that ultimately did win a Super Bowl, and you got to remember that. That's key context to hold on to. Then we get to the Titans. This was Harold Landry and not much else. I really liked where they got Landry at pick 41. Has he really lived up to it? I'd argue there's been times where he has, but a lot of his pass rush production just comes from the fact that he's always on the field. When he is healthy, they keep him out there no matter what. He is a true 3-down guy, which brings value. But when a lot of your production numbers, your sacks, your hurries, and all that sort of stuff comes from just the sheer volume that you play, it's a little less impressive than hey, this guy's just an absolute freak. But who knows? Maybe Harold Landry breaks out this year and gets that much better and does become an absolute freak, plus always on the field. Who knows? But yeah, Rashaan Evans didn't really work out, and then their 5th and 6th rounder, not much to talk about there. So I'm going to go C- because I still hold out hope that Landry could maybe take another step forward, and he has been a guy who's played a lot for them pre the injury last year. So I still like Harold Landry, so I'll go C-. But yeah, that's a tough one to grade there for the Titans. And only 4 picks too. Do you hold that against them, or do you use that as a caveat? I don't know. I think that depends on who's grading it. Then we get to Washington to round things out, and I'll save it one of the time because Darius Geis, that was a swing and a miss. Troy Apke is a workout warrior, but nothing else. Tim Settle was buried in the depth chart behind a lot of other better guys. Maybe Buffalo kind of takes advantage of what I think he can be as a player. And Sean Dion Hamilton, we kind of find solid enough linebacker. But yeah, this is Daron Payne, who I do think is a good player. Don't get me wrong. But he's another defensive tackle in the mix with Jonathan Allen. They already have a couple of good edge rushers, which those guys were drafted in later drafts. So Payne was still one of the earlier moves to address the defensive line. So I'll go C+. Payne's a good player, but it's Payne and no one else. So kind of the same grade I'm giving Minnesota, where you get this one really nice piece plus level starter, but when nothing else really hits, I can't give it a glowing grade despite how good I think O'Neal is and how good Payne still is as a player. So C+ there for Washington to round out our 2018 NFL regrade. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comment section. Looking back at this draft, who were the biggest winners, who were the biggest losers, and what do you think some of the biggest steals were? I'd love to hear your thoughts down below in the comment section. And of course, tell me who your favorite team is and what you would regrade your 2018 draft class. I'd love to hear all your thoughts on this group down below in the comments section. But hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Be sure to hit the like button if you did, and subscribe if you're new to the channel. I want to see more draft content, more football content in general like this. But that is going to do it for me. Hope you all have a fantastic rest of your day. And until next time, my name is Teach, and I am signing off.